welcome back to the Coach Dave Academy YouTube channel. My name is Bart. I've done some of the F4 lap guide videos on the channel, but today I'm going to be having a deep dive into the new wet weather system on iRacing. We're going to be having a look at the theory of wet weather driving, maybe a bit of the crossover between where wet weather driving is realistic on the sim, and where it's not so realistic, where the system could improve. I'm going to be giving you some of my personal experiences based on racing in the UK and in Europe and wet racing, coaching people in the wet, and how that applies not only to real life but the sim. And then we're also going to have a look at some tips and things you can use to improve your wet weather driving on the iRacing system. Before we get into looking at some of the real life footage and some of my driving on the sim, 3 basic tips I would advise always for wet driving, and this is something that I brought over from real life and probably the most basic fundamentals of what to do as soon as it starts to rain. The first one being move the brake bias back a bit. 3 or 4%, usually, sometimes 2%. It depends a lot on the car, the track, and how wet the conditions are, what kind of tires you're on, all that kind of stuff. But definitely want to move backwards on your brake bias. It makes a huge difference. As soon as it starts to rain, if you're on a dry setup with a normal car, you will start locking the fronts. So the reason for this is because in the dry, usually in most cars, yes, you've got rear engine cars and things with weird biases in terms of how big the master cylinders are front to rear, and that's why you get some cars like the Porsche Cup where you're running less than 50% brake bias. But in a traditional car, you're running 55, 60, 58%, that kind of thing. That is because you want to use the front brakes more. The reason for that is because there is more grip from the front tires available than the rear tires under braking. This is simply because as you go and hit the brakes into a corner, more of the weight moves on to the front of the car. That's just physics in terms of the inertia and the weight going over the front tires. To try and maximize that extra grip we have on the front axle under braking, especially under peak pressure, so peak load and the maximum grip you have at the start of the braking zone, we move the bias to the front just to give us a bit more efficiency on the brakes. So with that in mind, in the wet, you don't have the same grip to get the weight of the car over the front axle. As a result, you're not going to be able to run as far forward on the bias, and you had to bring it back in the wet. The other 2 parts that I go to as soon as it starts to rain, say you're at a track you've never driven before in a race and just starts to bucket it down. First thing is always get offline for the heavy braking zones. The heavy braking zones are by far the slipperiest parts of the track. This is where the most rubber has been placed onto the surface, and usually where you have those really big polished bumps you can see. In real life, I think of places like Spa, Bus Stop, La Source, Le Com. You've got Nürburgring into the final chicane and into turn 1. And you've got places like Snetterton that we are here, turn 2 and turn 4, the 2 hairpins. In all these types of corners, right at the start of where everyone's used to braking, let's say between 150 meters from the corner, you usually get a really large piece of polished track on the driving line. Avoid that at all costs. That's probably the most basic thing you're going to want to do. Move offline for those parts of the track. The third basic tip I would give is you really need to try and reduce the steering lock you have on exit. It's very easy to spin the wheels in the wet. Again, this is just because there's not the same grip available. The platform of the tires, not as much, especially if you're on a wet tire. Just think of it as slick as one piece of flat rubber, all connecting and pushing into the track. That's a much bigger contact patch than the treaded bits you have on a wet tire that's trying to channel the water and remove it from the surface and allow the tire to get more heat. With that in mind, it's really, really important to get the wheel as straight as possible. It is one of the most, it seems obvious or basic things I could possibly say, but if we're always talking lap time in the wet, it's something that never really goes wrong. If you always remind yourself, can I just try and drive the corner in a way that gets me to be a little bit straighter when I pick up throttle? Because where normally in dry conditions you could pick up the throttle and then maybe a few tenths of a second, maybe seconds later, you actually get the wheel straight, and normally you're fine just to kind of lean on the car on throttle. As you're turning out of the corner, that's not possible in the wet. You have to have the wheel dead straight to be able to put the power down, and that's hugely important, not only for avoiding spinning out and crashing, but also for getting good lap time and having really strong exits. All right, so as a real-life example, we've got some older footage of me racing in a British F3 car in 2020, actually, as you can see in the bottom left, at a very, very, very wet Snetterton circuit. And then we're going to have a little look at a comparison and how that pairs up to some F4 running I've done around there on iRacing. So the first thing is with real life, especially in these really wet conditions, Snetterton is an interesting example to use because at the time it was one of the worst tracks in the wet I'd ever driven. Now it is probably the worst track in the UK, and by that I mean it's the time difference between a wet lap and a dry lap is massive, just because of the surface is not very good at dealing with water, at getting rid of water. A lot of it becomes very slippery. It's hard to generate tire temperature. All those things make it very difficult. However, there has been a few parts of the track resurface in the last few years and into this season, which has made it a little bit easier. But at the time, especially, there was no newer parts of the track, and it was all quite difficult to drive. So here we've got some footage from, as I said, an F3 race. We've got some cars and things. So you can see the spray is not fantastic either in terms of visibility. And keep in mind, whatever we're seeing on this video is far better than what I would have been able to see from my helmet at the time. But it is still quite a good example for showing, what parts of the track people are using in high-level championships for wet weather driving, and general parts of technique and things that we can compare to iRacing. So here, going to turn 1 at Snetterton, here in a car like this with a lot of downforce especially, you probably could stay on the left-hand side of the track like this. I find more and more now with this track in particular, we're having to go more towards the middle of the track for braking. As I previously mentioned, heavy braking, even though this isn't going to be a massively heavy braking zone, just because it's a 5th or 4th gear corner, maybe in a GT car. And a 6th gear corner actually is flat out in the wet in the new F3s. But you don't really have massive braking forces there as a result. So usually it's not somewhere you have to go too far offline, maybe maximum half a car. And we'll get into that a bit on the F4 car. But you can see here I'm braking online as well as the cars in front of me as well. And down to 5th gear and then 4th. So into here, the main thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to avoid the rubber. I'm trying to avoid the rubber. I'm trying to go deep into the corner. And quite a lot of times in the wet, you kind of have to, imagine where traditionally you would have an apex. So this corner in particular, right? This is a corner where normally your, let's say, apex is going to be this inside curve on the right. I know it's a bit hard to see, but the red and white curve on the inside is kind of where you meet the inside of the track, and then you kind of just go out from there. In a lot of places in the wet, you got to think of your apex, or I usually like to think of it for, changeable conditions is a good reason why. Your minimum speed point or your rotation point, that slowest point, the corner where you really want to rotate the car, that's kind of where you're aiming towards, and then you deviate from there and then begin your exit as you start to get on the throttle. So in a long corner like turn 1 here, where it's got actually a double apex, I'm kind of looking into the middle of the corner, quite wide, near the outside white line, and using that to kind of square off and go out towards the exit rather than trying to hold it near the inside. Because if I turn in normally here, well, you can see at this moment I've crossed the rubber on the inside, and this is why I've had a big moment here. If I stayed a little bit wider, it wouldn't have been so bad. But I always find, for Snetterton in particular, it's good to cut in a little bit, not fully to the inside, but just a little bit. So you just shorten the distance a bit, carry a bit more speed, because you're already going to be forced out to the left anyway. There's no point really just staying on the outside and then turning around. You might as well kind of point the car in and give yourself a better position, and, like I said, a bit less distance as well. But yeah, in these extreme wet conditions, we're way offline. And again, you got cars with a lot of downforce here, so you can kind of use extra bits of the track and use a lot of the track, and it's going to hurt you too much. All right. So now cutting back now, there's a lot of water usually on the left-hand side here, which makes it quite tricky. Usually in the dry, you're going to be pushing out towards an exit curb, which is over here on the left-hand side. However, today we're just trying to kind of go up the middle. Again, I talked previously about you want to have the wheel dead straight when you're on throttle, like dead straight, because otherwise, even in 4th or 5th gear on a track like this, if you hit the rubber line and you have some steering lock on, that can be a one-way trip into a barrier or a very big slide. So very, very important to have the steering lock straight. And you can see here, as soon as I catch the car, feed the throttle, I'm trying to really be smooth on the steering. I know there's kind of some adjustments there just to kind of counter steer, but I'm not trying to put any big amounts of lock on when I'm on throttle. I'm just trying to feed the car out to the edge of the track here. Again, here you want to kind of join the edge of the track. Still not full throttle, only full throttle now, which is quite late on the exit. We're already well past the exit curb, only up to, like I said, full throttle now. And this is in their F3 car, so it gives you an idea of how treacherous a track like this is in the wet. Whereas in real life, you'd be going through here and you'd easily be full throttle just as you come past the inside curb. All right. So turn 2 is a hairpin. Braking offline now, hit the peak pressure offline between the 2 board and the 1 board, roughly in the way. It's kind of a bit tricky to say. But like I said, most important thing, always when I start going to a wet track, or even if it starts to sprinkle and you're on a slick tire, those rubbered parts of the track, they become very, very, very slick in these conditions. So you need to avoid those heavy braking zones. So here, this is like the slipperiest part of the track for sure. Even if it sprinkles and you're on a slick tire, you can feel it here. You can feel the car move around a bit. So it's not that uncommon in those conditions where I'd maybe go car width or a bit more offline to the middle of the track and just move myself back over to the left-hand side to prepare the car for the corner. Now you might think, oh, I thought we were supposed to stay off the rubber. This is all about, the traditional karting line. You might have seen, Verstappen's quite well known for it in some of his earlier driving in Formula One and things like that. Schumacher potentially as well. Yes, we do want to stay off the rubber. However, like I said, the peak braking is where we're going to lose most of our performance. We actually need to move back to the left-hand side of the track on a corner like this, just to try and open up the angle of the corner a bit so we can rotate the car earlier and it can prepare for the exit a bit better. So you see, with that in mind, I've moved the car back towards the inside, kind of the edge of the white line. A very similar line to what you take on the sim, actually, I found the wet here. And then you go over to the left-hand side of the track. Again, wheel very, very straight. Only starting to put the throttle on once the wheel is basically dead straight. But yeah, forced over to the left-hand side of the track here. And again, you might think, oh, well, you've rejoined the rubber line. Why didn't you stay under it? Again, yeah, okay, I could have stayed on the right-hand side of the track. But once I get that initial that initial power down, where you're most vulnerable to wheel spin, you start to pick some speed up, especially in a car with downforce. Remember, the faster you go, the more downforce you have, the more grip you have. In the wet, this is even more important. It's really important to try and carry corner speed. Yeah. Because one of the most common things you see with inexperienced drivers, especially when they're struggling to get temperature in their tires because they're not carrying enough speed and, actually putting enough load into the tires in the corner, is that they don't carry enough speed into corners in the wet. They try to brake hard, they lock up. They try to get on throttle early, they spin the wheels. They're not carrying enough speed. They end up too tight to the inside, on the rubber line, too slow, in the lower gear with higher revs. They get on throttle and they loop it round. What you really want to do is, like I said, position the car so you can get the wheels straight. I was off the rubber, right? Initially, over here, we're all trying to go off the rubber initially. And then as we pick up speed, we can kind of deviate towards the left. And the thing is, you're also affording yourself that room. Like, I could just go straight, but I might as well afford myself that room. So as the car starts to slide over to the left-hand side of the track, I've got all that room to kind of feed the power and push the car that way. And then we're going to turn 3 at Sanderson, which is for me, is one of the most infamous corners, personally, in the wet, in terms of how tricky it is to drive, how challenging it is, and the amount of time you can gain or lose, and it's very low grip. So it's quite a quick corner. In the dry, it's 4th gear, very quick in an F3 car. Still 4th gear in the wet, but only really, you'd want to be in 3rd, but it's 4th, kind of from what I just said, right? You really want to roll the speed. And also, if you get in 3rd, you just wheel spin on the exit, which we'll get to in a second. So here, you've got to kind of point the car out towards the outside white line. And this is kind of a lot of what I talked about before, where I have a minimum speed point. When I go into this corner in the wet, I look to be here, where this red car is in front of us, where this rain light is currently. That's where I kind of aim for, to be on the entry. So instead of having an apex here that I kind of turn around, I want to rotate the car out here somewhere. That's my rotation point, my minimum speed point, as it were, right? So I'm going to position the car as I go into here and just allow the car to kind of slide wide, brake, point the car in a little bit, and just allow it to run deep, kind of understeer wide up to the white line. Then I'm going to start to pick up throttle, only part throttle. And then as I get it straight now, I'm going to pick up full throttle. I touched the curb there. If I went full throttle on that curb, I would have just, a lot could have happened. Maybe potentially a crash, but almost certainly I would have lost a lot of time. So super important, especially in a corner like this. When you rejoin the rubber, this corner specifically, the car moves around. You can kind of see it just a little bit here. Car moves around right there, very loose. So with that in mind, now moving over to the left-hand side of the track, again, getting off the rubber for the peak braking. So this is into turn 4, which is another hairpin, very similar to turn 2 technique-wise. You get off the rubber for the peak, then you kind of just run deep into the corner, rotate the car off the rubber. So once again, I'm looking to have, in this scenario, I'm looking to rotate the car out here where there's lots of grip, where there's less water, and where other cars have been running, and where there is less rubber. So I have a lot more just bite from the tire into the road. Rotate the car out here, try and point the car on the exits, get the wheel straight as early as possible, and then afford some room for the car to run wide. Here, another quick corner. You kind of just run offline. Again, run off the rubber line here. This is another good example of, you can see if you look at the track, if you look at the video, this is all slippery. You can kind of see it's polished. There's a slippery nature to it, the curb as well as the inside line here. If you touch this, if I'm a tire width further left, big moment, big slide, and I have some difficulties keeping the car on the track. We're all out here, seeing this part of the track that's been cleared more, where everyone's running to try and avoid the rubber line. Gun throttle. You can see as it rejoins the rubber there, the car's moving around. That's how much of a difference it makes. This is a weird corner. This one, I've seen a lot of different lines. Traditionally now, you kind of brake either mid-track to get off the rubber from the peak pressure braking, or you brake on the left-hand side just to open it up. You usually run deep, run past the rubber, rotate the car off the rubber, then cut in tight. If you follow the rubber line, which in the dry goes out here somewhere, that's where we run the dry. You force the car out from the initial apex curb and then run it around the outside. If you run over it and stay out there, you have a massive moment up here. You get a lot of wheel spin. So very important to try and cut underneath here, and again, get the wheels straight, get the car rotated really succinctly. So really try to rotate the car as quickly as possible. That's the other reason why we try to get off the rubber line. Then get the wheels straight at this point. And then we go into turn 7 onto the back straight. So this is a corner, again, where you just try to roll the car wide, right? You're trying to position the car for the exit. And just try and run deep here. Get the car off the rubber, rotate the car, be straighter on throttle. So you see here, turn 6, as I said, we're cutting back under the rubber here. Then to turn 7 onto the back straight. Just trying to run the car as wide as possible. It's another really, really tricky corner in the wet. So you've got to be super brave here. If you touch the white line of the grass, you're straight off in that barrier pretty much. So takes a bit of bravery. But you need to get the car as close as possible to that white line. You can see here I was a little bit off, but fairly close. We just try and delay the slowest point in the corner, so our minimum speed as much as possible. If you slow the car down early, rotate the car early, you cut back and you'll end up somewhere here. There is no grip over here on this rubber part of the track, and you go sideways very easily, and it ruins your exit for the longest straight on the track. So we need to try and hang the car around the outside, push the entry, soft on the brake, carry as much speed as possible, roll the speed, and then try and get the car as straight as possible when you get on throttle. Just watch here, my throttle input in the top left and my steering. So I just try to get it straight, now straight, feed throttle. It's very, very tricky. Very, very, very tricky in these conditions. And then you can see here, this is a straight. I'm trying to move around, trying to get out of the spray a little bit. So on the back straight, not much to say here. This straight in particular, there's a crest in the middle, so you can kind of run down the middle of the track. Maybe there's a little bit less water, kind of resisting your movement there, especially when it's really aquaplaning. You got a lot of standing water. I've certainly had races where it's like that, but a lot of tracks can be like this, where there's a crest or higher part at the middle of the road. It's usually worth remembering, like I said, especially in torrential conditions. Braking now for the section under the bridge. You can brake offline. I've seen people do it because, yes, it's a heavy braking zone. However, the gain is not enough for me. You need to be on the right-hand side here. It's too much work to be on the middle of the track and then turn right and then back left again. It's quite tricky. So into a slow corner, that's usually an okay thing to do. But you might have noticed into a lot of the fast corners, it's been more about how can I roll speed and just run deep at the apex. I think on a lot of normal tracks, what we did back at turn 5, where we only just kind of ran mid-track, is kind of what you more normally do in the wet offline, is you just run like maybe half a car, just a car width offline for the high-speed corners. You just need the loader tires offline, but here you can see very wet track. I'm having to use extreme wet lines. I'm trying to stay off the rubber all the way through that section. Very, very tricky because it's a combination corner. You might think, oh, you just took the dry line. Not really. So normally in the dry, you would have turned in a little bit earlier. I'm kind of just trying to hang the right-hand side tires, my loaded tires in this section, off the rubber. So they're just sitting just off the rubber, all the way around. So the reason why I'm not going all the way out, which I could do, and there's more grip out there. There's probably a little bit more grip. It's not worth it. Partly because if I go all the way to the right, I'm not going to make it back to the left. And it's important to be left here. As anyone who's driven Senator will know, this exit is very important. So it's important to position the car and kind of prepare for what's coming next in this scenario. But also, again, the distance. There's a lot of times in the wet where you can run extremely wide. You can run an extremely aggressive wet line, but it doesn't pay off because that extra distance is not worth it. Turn 2 is a good example here. Some people run all the way around the outside. I never found that was worth it. Yeah, you might get a slightly better exit. Yeah, you might brake slightly later, but you're just taking so much extra distance. The amount of extra time you're using there, especially at low speed, is just not worth it. So with that in mind, just off the rubber, you can see again, I kind of rotate the car just past the rubber, go into a bit of understeer. Again, trying to get the car dead straight on, smooth on throttle. Again, smooth on the steering, roll the speed in. Not very complicated, very difficult to do. But those kind of basics kind of keep you in line. And then we got, this is Corum, which is probably one of the most difficult corners in the wet, I know, especially when you're coaching people. This part of the track is treacherous. You can see it's slick with water, it's polished. There's not even necessarily that much water here. And this is just what that part of the track looks like. If you turn in early, there is no grip. For some reason, it just holds a ton of water. It's very rubbered here. If you drive them, I've tried to overtake people, but at the inside here, you end up always certainly having a crash with them if they're on your left. It is very, very tricky. Much better to hang it around the outside here where all the grip is. Hit these loaded tires offline. Don't try to run into these little puddles on the outside. Go as wide as you dare, carry as much speed as possible, and then try and bring the car back to the right before we go towards braking. You can kind of do a mid-track line depending on how wet it is. This weekend I found it's a little bit better to prepare fully. They kind of throw the car in mid-track. Going fully wide to prepare it's a good example, right? You could if you want to, and some people have done it. They go down here, they rotate the car, and they get out there. For me, not worth it. You gain a little bit on exit, but generally your wheel spinning. The thing is, you wheel spin anyway. You know, the bit that you're limited by is basically the same, whether you take this line or this line. So you might as well shorten the distance, roll a bit more speed. And again, if you roll a bit more speed, the throttle pickup is going to be easier because you're not going from such a low speed. So you're going to be able to pick up the throttle and not have as many traction issues. Whereas, yeah, if you're at a very low speed and you're trying to accelerate the car a lot, that's when you get a lot of wheel spin high up in the RPM. Roll the car in. Super straight on the wheel once again. And now you can just see I try to keep it on the dry part of the track on the straights where other people have been running on the drying lines and things like that. Okay, so in terms of the basic idea of wet weather driving, especially if you already have experience, as I imagine you do, on sim racing or some kind of racing game in normal dry conditions or just driving, on a road as you normally do. The first thing you know, of course, from just watching racing or, as I said, having driven a car on a wet road before, you know that suddenly your grip level is not so good. The stopping distances are longer. You had the ability to spin the wheels a lot easier. You're not going to be able to go as fast through corners. And that's just simply because there's not as much friction between the tire and the road. That's standard for wet conditions. But what we kind of get into a bit more when we're talking about learning the craft of wet weather racing, the wet weather driving, is where to use certain parts of the racetrack where you might not normally. In the more drier conditions, maybe even in mixed conditions. So with that in mind, in the wet weather, we're really going to be aware of not only the traditional rubber line, but also more polished parts of the track. And that's why you've got things like white lines, curbs, maybe some AstroTurf that's painted, all those kind of things. And you can just have bits of track that have been more polished over time. That's quite common if you watch something like Formula One or different circuits in European racing. You'll see that there's some parts of the track that are a bit shinier than others. And usually that means they're more polished. They become slipperier when they're wet. They don't absorb the water as well. And they lose grip in the wet conditions. For today's purposes, I'm going to be using a full wet track to discuss what we're talking about. By that, I mean the track is completely wet, not standing water everywhere and covered in puddles and waterlogged, and you're just going to get aquaplaning every second because at that point you're not really driving, and 99% of the time in modern racing that's going to be a red flag. But more so the whole track's covered in water. There's a lot of spray. Maybe there's a few puddles here and there. All the curbs and the white lines are generally unusable in conditions like these, but it's not like a drying track or a greasy track where there's barely any water to keep your wet tires cool, and there's starting to get so some of those dry patches and things that move you back towards the driving line. With that in mind, as I said, it's all about trying to use the grippier parts of the track offline, off the rubber, to try and give yourself better exits, carry more speed into corners, and just feel safer on the track. Quite often, if you find yourself on the rubber line, you'll be going off the track very quickly and usually onto wet grass, which basically just speeds you up straight into a barrier. So, in terms of how all of this wet weather theory and what I've shown you in real life, how that applies to iRacing, well, I'm happy to say a lot of it translates actually very, very well. You have to quite significantly change the parts of the track you use when it rains, especially when there's a lot of water on track. You have to be very smooth on the steering to avoid getting wheel spin. The curves and the painted lines are very effective. And finally, a sim has done that. I don't know why that's taken so long, but finally, a simulator has actually punished you for running on the curbs and the white lines. So thank you, iRacing. And the puddle formation is also very good as well, in terms of where the puddles form, how much of them there are, how they affect the car, aquaplaning, standing water, locking up through those puddles, and things like that. So from that point of view, I think iRacing's been very, very strong, and a lot of what I said about the real life driving is also true on iRacing. Now, a few things I'll just say that I probably have issues with the current wet model. One thing is how consistent the rubbered line is. So I'll show you that here in a sec, actually. While we're at Snetterton, which is obviously the same track we were looking at before on their 3 car, I'll now show you some onboard from an F4 on iRacing, and you'll notice a few things. So it's only very slight, but the front left locks here. Very hard not to lock that. I did quite a few laps, so it's not just this lap, it's every single lap. It was very, very easy to lock the front tires when I went over the rubber here. Now, look, you might say, well, Bart, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can see you're going over the polished part of the track, as you can kind of see here. You're going across the rubber line, there's a reduction in grip, and the tires start to lock. And I would say, yes, that is true, Mr. Viewer. However, I think it's a bit too punishing in terms of there are points on the track, and this is not just a track specific thing. This isn't me just saying, some surfaces are better than others, and there's like grippier patches and less grippier patches. I think it's unfair to expect that of iRacing. I mean, I think when we look at some of the newer tracks, the wet weather stuff's actually a little bit better, just because those models are a little bit more advanced. When we're looking at a track like Snetterton, or I've used Donington, they're a bit older models, and so there's less detail in them than some of the newer tracks we have available on the service. But I think it's important to understand that the rubber line's a bit too consistent in how it takes away grip, okay? So it's more almost like this is the rubbered part of the track, here's a line, and that just drops your grip. Whereas, as I said, in real life, there's really points on the track where that's a lot worse. So you got your start of the heavy braking zones is usually the worst. You got bits where you rejoin the rubber, kind of like that here on the exit of turn 3 at Snetterton, you have a lump. That it doesn't so much spike as much in these places as it does in real life. It's more just a consistent line. And you'll see it here again, braking to turn 4, very easy. See the locking here, see how the car moves around as it go over the rubber. Again, in a part that entry as you turn in there, it isn't nearly as polished as or kind of bumpy as the start of the braking zone. And that's something that I think just punishes you a bit too much on iRacing. And it's not. This isn't a fantastic track to show it, because in real life as well, you have to go quite far offline in the higher speed corners. This turn 5 is potentially the best corner to show it. You can see we're going quite a bit wider here than I was on the real life lap. And if you look at turn 1, which is the other high-speed corner, Rich's, you can see going further offline on the braking, still far offline here, but staying offline in this part of the corner. And certainly that was something I found as I went to a lot of other tracks as well on iRacing. Silverstone was a good example, going to Maggotts Beckett's, where in real life, Maggotts Beckett's is not horrendous in the wet. Yeah, sure, it's scary because it's high speed and you're moving around the wet conditions. However, the grip loss there is a lot less than the slow speed corners like a Brooklands or something like that around Silverstone, or the chicane, where you're really fighting with the car at low speeds on the rubber part of the track. But in those high speed corners, generally, there's just less rubber put into the road. Cars slide around less, cars wheel spin less. There's less rubber put in, like, as I said, from those heavy braking zones, things like that. So as a result, in the high speed corners, generally, you can run on the line or a lot closer to the dry line. And that's something I haven't really seen as much on iRacing. As I said, it's always consistent rubber. It's not so much, here's a bad patch, go off it, and then it's kind of okay to rejoin over this bit. It's more just consistent in the grip loss. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Another thing that I think could be a little bit better is when the track starts to dry out, I think it's a little bit too easy to go back to the dry line. So by that, I mean that when there's some water on the track, when it's kind of low water levels and it's greasy, yeah, okay, it's the same as in real life. On iRacing, you're going to start looking to go back towards the dry line. This is one of the hardest things to master. I struggle with it myself, and I've been racing for quite a few years. Always staying on top of how the track's changing. If it's getting wetter, then you're trying to move a little bit more offline, trying to avoid where the standing water is. Usually that's actually a little bit easier because the track, it just gets dangerous if you keep driving where you were before and you have big moments, maybe aquaplane on a straight, something like that. But when we're talking about drying track, you have to really look for the bits of the track that I don't physically just mean, oh, there's a dry patch driving the dry patch, but well before that, the bits where there's a bit less standing water, the bits where, okay, now there's a little bit more grip just from cars running along there and clearing a little bit of water off the line that might not be full wet or full dry, but kind of in the middle of the track. Things like that. I feel like at the moment, yes, you do look for that, but too early are you able to go fully to the dry line. And this track is a fairly good example of that because in real life, it's very, very greasy. As I've kind of explained, this track's very low grip. And so even if it's just a little bit of water hanging around, very tricky to go back to the dry line until you're 100% on slick tires. And I think that's the case for a lot of tracks. You wouldn't be braking on the dry line until you're on slicks, basically. And even then, potentially, when you start to go onto slicks, it might be a little bit dodgy in some of those areas where, again, the rubber is really bad and the track's really polished in those parts of the track. So those are some of my gripes. I think also it would be nicer on some tracks. Again, it's a little bit inconsistent from track to track. Some tracks, it's hard to see the more polished parts of the track on iRacing, whereas I think in real life, it's quite obvious when a piece of the track's slipperier. Again, this is subjective because it's not 100% kind of true or false over in real life. Is if a part of the track has less grip, it doesn't always look like it, but I think generally it is the case. You can see a polished surface. You can see the water not sinking into the surface. If you've got a smoother surface, it kind of looks very slippery, painted, polished. That's why you see a white line and it looks slippery by nature. And the same thing is true for a lot of track surfaces, a lot of different types of tarmac. On iRacing, quite often you'll see it's more consistent in the color. I think, again, the standing water and the puddles, that's really good. That's really, really good. But if we look here at straight, for example, and then into the braking zone. So here right now, there is nothing to tell me that this is more polished. I promise you in real life here, you can 100% see that this part of the track looks slippery in the wet. 100%. Same for turn 2 as well. You got these puddles again. I think that's really good, but you cannot see this is more polished. You can kind of see a little bit of rubber from when it was dry, like a little bit, but it's not really the same as what I want to see in real life. And again, some of the newer tracks I think are a little bit better. So this isn't just a plain a pure fault with the whole system, but I think it's something that's a little bit annoying because you have to learn the tracks almost exactly where the rubber is and isn't sometimes, and that's a little bit annoying in a way because say it starts to rain on a track you haven't practiced wet before, it can put you a bit more of a disadvantage where maybe in real life it's a bit more obvious because you can see where there's less grip. And I think that makes it a bit more intuitive and a bit more fun to learn as well. So going from that now on a few more positive things, I want to say the first is the wet tire doesn't overheat, let's say, which is good because it shouldn't, because especially when it's really wet, cold tires actually struggle to keep heat. And I found the F4 car, especially, it's a struggle to keep heat in it. So we might actually have to play around for pressures for once in iRacing. So that's a bit of a positive. Car setup wise, do wet setups work? Maybe is my answer at the moment. I think, again, this depends. A lot of teams and a lot of cars in real life, the belief is to keep it the same as the dry car. So it depends. It really does depend on how wet the conditions are. The track is a big factor as well as the car and the tire. So again, with all those things, it's quite nuanced. It's quite tricky to give a yes or no answer. But I have found with the F4 car that the dry setups work quite well. Only if it's a low downforce setup do you really need to put some more wing on it. And in fact, I've been putting a bit more oversteer, a bit more rotation into the wet setup, if anything, because I found it's understeering quite a bit. Whereas the GTP car is basically undrivable on the dry setups, from my experience. So those cars need a big change towards more of a wet setup, a bit softer, working in different ride heights, things like that. So do the wet setups work? Maybe. Kind of sometimes, but there is definitely something to it. Things that I do really like, you can see through this section, for example, this is very similar to the line as well as saying in real life. Again, Snetterton, I think, is quite a good track to use as an example because it's so extreme wet. I think it lends itself to the iRacing wet. I think some of the tracks that are grippier surfaces, like newer surfaces, and again, you can't expect iRacing to kind of change the track models all the time because that's what a wet track does. It doesn't only change every minute, it changes every month in terms of how the history of the track and what's run over it affects change in surface. So it's an extremely difficult thing to get 100% accurate, but if we get the basics right, I think it's a really strong system. But you can see here, going past the rubber, rotating the car off the rubber, cutting back. I think it works very, very well. It's very similar to real life. And again, here, kind of understeering, forcing the car wide towards the white line, staying wide, trying to get you straighter on throttle. Then all the water building up on the left-hand side out straight. Again, very reminiscent of what I've experienced in races at Snetterton in the past in the wet. So these are all huge positives. I think the way, as I said, the way puddles interact is very good as well. Like very easy to lock up and drive through a puddle and have a big moment. The white lines, the curbs, they spin you very easily. You have to stay off them. Again, here, the fact I have to sit off the rubber line, I think there's a lot right. I think there's a lot right with the iRacing weather system. And even though, again, there's a lot of improvements and, there's things like if you go to say a track was brand new resurface, you would be driving dead on the dry line. Would iRacing have that? I don't know, because iRacing is kind of like a time capsule to whenever that track was modeled by the team. So, you go to Snetterton now, it doesn't really look like this. But if you go to Zandvoort, which is one of the newer models, it looks exactly the same, pretty much, as the track model in iRacing. So, unfortunately, that's something that I think's difficult to model, and it's just inherently part of the wet weather driving experience that is going to be difficult to capture in iRacing. But I think the way the weather comes in is quite good. One thing is the slick tires seem to last a little bit too long. I tried it myself. Slick tires work a bit too early. There's too much water on track, but the slick tires still generate temperature, so keep that in mind for your races. Like, it might not look dry, but try and go into the slicks fairly early once the track's cleared up quite a bit, because you're going to lose a lot of time to the people in slicks. But in real life, it's much more about temperature generation. And so it's too dry for wets when the wets overheat. As soon as you get temperature in a slick tire, you need to be on that slick tire. That's all a slick needs. It can cut through little patches of water, right? But if there's a few dry patches around, if there's enough dry patches that it can generate heat, the slick tire is going to work. And a slick tire is pretty much always going to be faster than a wet tire once it's generating heat and operating effectively on the track. And again, this section is quite a good example as well through Quorum, which is a really, really difficult, really fun corner in the wet. You got to hang it out around the outside here. Again, very reminiscent of real life. There's kind of a puddle there as well. The way the water builds up with the grooves in the road. Kind of go towards prepping the car again. Mid-track there. Bit of a slide and exit there from me. Overall, I think the iRacing weather system is very, very positive. It's a big step. It's the best weather system I've ever seen to sim. There's still a lot of problems with it, as I've outlined, and I'm very hopeful that a lot of those are going to get fixed and improved over time. But I think regardless, it's going to add a huge amount to everybody's race experience in iRacing, especially in terms of strategy elements in the longer races, in the special events, in the 1 hour officials, things like that. The setup work in terms of setting up a car in the wet, learning the wet lines, how it affects multi-class racing. I think there's a lot of exciting elements we're getting with the wet weather system. I just hope they continue to improve it and they don't kind of just leave it and forget about it for the future. So in terms of rounding up and giving you an idea of my main takeaways, my main piece of advice, I'd probably give and a few tips for driving on the wet in iRacing. The first thing is break off line. You're going to lock up really easily. That's why you got to bring the bias back, break off line, and don't hit high brake pressures. You can see here into this corner, I'm not going over 30, 35% brake pressure. That's normal in the wet. Nothing's broken, nothing's wrong. You can't hit high brake pressure. You don't have the grip for it. You don't have as good a tire. So just be aware of that and try and manage that as best as possible. Rotate the car off the rubber as well. Make sure you're going deep and wide into the corners. Again, the car's straight on throttle, trying to use all the track on the exit. It's a common thing, people braking just far too early in the wet. Yes, you're not going to be able to stop the car as quickly, but you can see here, I'm not actually braking to meet the inside where I would in the dry, right? So I'm not trying to get to this inside curb here. I'm trying to get all the way out here. Because of that, people don't adjust their braking distance correctly. They brake earlier, but they brake early enough so they can make the inside curb still, which is just completely false. You've also got to think, I'm actually braking a lot further into the corner. So the braking distance doesn't change as much as you think. You're not braking that much earlier than you would in the dry, especially as things start to dry up. There starts to be less standing water, more grip, but you're still on the wet line. So please keep that in mind. Push those entries nice and deep. Otherwise, you won't be able to rotate the car fully off the rubber in hairpins like that, and you won't get the wheel straight on throttle. You're going to get terrible exits, and you're going to lose control. 2 more things to quickly run through. One is gears. Too often in the wet, people drop down to really, really low gears for no reason. Okay, yeah, you might use lower gears because you are traveling a bit slower, but please remember that we want to keep the rolling speed up, and that if you go to a lower gear and you get on the throttle, you're going to be having traction issues. You're also not going to be getting to the throttle as quickly as you would in the dry. As you can see out of there, if I was in first gear, I would have had a big moment. Keeping the car in second. In the high-speed corners, and keeping the car in third and fourth gear, whatever kind of gear I'm getting up to. It's not that different from the dry. Maybe 1 gear lower, maybe 1 gear lower or the same gear is quite often where you end up in a lot of corners in the wet. Don't try to do drastic action and go crazy different with the gears you're using. That's usually a recipe for disaster. It means you're not taking enough speed through the corners and you're overslowing the car. The last tip I'd give is standing starts. When you're doing a standing start in the wet, the car's going to want a wheel spin a lot. Just try to pull away really gently. What we were kind of always told growing up racing is just pull away as if you're, pulling out of a car park, basically, pulling away to go to the shop, something like that. It's genuinely like that. Slowly, nicely let the clutch out and just be really smooth. Like 10, 20, 30, 40% throttle, something like that. You don't need to be on 100% throttle and dropping the clutch aggressively or preloading or anything like that. Just try and be smooth, pull away, and don't get any wheel spin. I hope you found some of the tips and tricks and different things we talked about in this video helpful and valuable in your own racing. Please tell us if you have any questions or what you think of the new iRacing wet weather system in the comments below. And you can also find the Coach Dave Academy Discord link in the YouTube video description. My name is Bart. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you for another time on the Coach Dave Academy YouTube channel. See ya.